How's the rent?
What would you do if the most dangerous man in the country lived on the other side of your bedroom wall? For 2 grueling years, Hazel hid in the forgotten, crawling spaces of Blackwood Keep, stealing scraps from the kitchen and breathing in the shadows of monsters. She watched the ruthless alpha, Silas Blackwood, rule his empire with an iron fist. Convinced she was a ghost, she thought she was completely invisible. Until one cold November night, the ancient floorboards gave way, dropping her straight into his private study. He didn't kill her. He didn't even flinch. He just looked up from his mahogany desk, his eyes flashing a predatory gold, and asked, "How's the rent?" Blackwood Keep was not a home. It was a fortress masquerading as a sprawling Gothic estate, nestled deep in the unforgiving, fog-choked mountains of the Pacific Northwest. Built in the late 1800s by a paranoid lycanthrope architect, the manor was a labyrinth of dualities. There were the grand halls with their sweeping mahogany staircases and crystal chandeliers, built for the public eye. And then there were the veins of the house, the narrow, hollow corridors between the walls, the servant chutes, and the hidden observation gaps, designed for a forgotten era of pack warfare. This hidden world was where Hazel had built her life. She was 22 years old, human, and legally a ghost. 2 years ago, the Blackwood pack had decimated her hometown, wiping out a rogue faction of wolves that had taken over the local council. In the crossfire, Hazel, a simple human caught in the brutal politics of shifters, had been trapped inside the Blackwood estate while delivering a restoration commission of antique books. When the lockdown occurred, she had panicked. Knowing the infamous reputation of Alpha Silas Blackwood and his disdain for human witnesses, she had slipped behind a loose tapestry in the library and into the skeletal framework of the keep. She intended to stay for one night. One night turned into a week, then a month, and eventually a harrowing 2-year sentence of survival. Living in the walls required a meticulous, exhausting discipline. Hazel mapped every creaking floorboard and every shifting beam. She learned the sleep cycles of the wolves, synchronizing her movements with the heavy, rhythmic breathing that vibrated through the plaster. Her diet consisted of whatever she could pilfer from the massive industrial kitchens between the hours of 3 and 4 in the morning. Heels of stale bread, forgotten apples, wheels of sharp cheddar, and occasionally a discarded piece of roasted meat that she would hoard like treasure. To hide from the hypersensitive noses of the werewolves, Hazel employed a dangerous and desperate chemistry. She lined her cramped nest, a 3-by-5-foot crawl space above the west wing, with dried lavender, pine needles, and cold fireplace ash she scraped from the chimneys. She rubbed the ash into her skin and clothes, suppressing her natural scent until she smelled like the house itself. Old stone, damp wood, and history. From her hidden vantage points, Hazel watched the drama of the Blackwood pack unfold like a twisted, silent stage play. Her favorite peephole was a tiny, rusted ventilation grate positioned perfectly near the ceiling of the grand study. It was here she observed Alpha Silas. Silas Blackwood was a terrifying figure. Standing well over 6 feet, he moved with the lethal, fluid grace of an apex predator. His hair was pitch black, often falling into striking, amber-colored eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He was a man of few words, preferring to let his intimidating physical presence and the violent reputation of his wolf do the talking. Hazel watched him execute traitors with a chilling calmness. She watched him orchestrate corporate takeovers that brought millions into the pack's coffers. She also watched the quiet, solitary moments when he would sit by the roaring fire, a glass of amber whiskey in his hand, staring into the flames with an expression of profound, crushing exhaustion. Despite her terror of him, Hazel found herself morbidly fascinated. She knew the cadence of his voice better than she remembered the sound of her own. She knew he hated the taste of the expensive chamomile tea his housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, forced on him. She knew he ran his hand over the back of his neck when he was losing his temper with his beater, a slippery, sharp-eyed man named Garrick. Garrick was the true venom in the house. While Silas was brutal but fiercely principled, Garrick was ambitious and entirely devoid of loyalty. Over the past 6 months, Hazel had crouched in the freezing drafts of the walls, her ear pressed to the plaster, listening to Garrick whisper in the shadowy corridors with Rosalind, a high-ranking female wolf who felt spurned by Silas's continued refusal to take her as his mate. The pack is growing restless with his isolation. Hazel had heard Rosalind hiss just a week prior, her voice dripping with venom. A strong alpha needs an Luna. Silas acts like a mourning widower for a mate he's never even met. Patience, Rosalind, Garrick had replied, his tone smooth and treacherous. The winter solstice is approaching. The council will demand a show of strength. If he fails to secure the southern borders, his weakness will be public. Then, we make our move. Hazel knew she was hoarding dangerous secrets. If the wolves knew a human had been listening to their most intimate betrayals, they would tear the walls apart with their bare hands to get to her. She was a ghost who knew too much, and the isolation was beginning to fracture her mind. She spent hours talking to the spiders that shared her crawl space, her voice a reedy, silent whisper. She was fading away, becoming nothing more than dust and lavender, a forgotten heartbeat trapped in the ribs of a beast. But the approaching winter was harsher than the last. The drafts in the walls turned into slicing blades of ice. The ash and pine needles couldn't completely mask the scent of her own creeping sickness as a respiratory infection took root in her lungs. She was coughing, forcing herself to muffle the sounds with a stolen, moth-eaten woolen blanket. She was slipping. Her routine was getting sloppy, and in a house full of apex predators, a single mistake meant death. The night of the winter solstice brought a storm of biblical proportions. Thunder rattled the stained glass windows of Blackwood Keep, and rain lashed against the stone in violent sheets. The noise was a blessing. It covered the sound of Hazel's ragged, rattling breaths. She had not eaten in 3 days. The kitchen had been commandeered for the solstice feast, swarming with caterers and pack members around the clock. Driven to the edge of delirium by starvation and fever, Hazel made a reckless decision. She would descend into the pantry connected to Silas's private study. The Alpha was hosting a council meeting in the Great Hall. His study would be empty, and he always kept a stash of high-calorie protein bars and dried venison jerky in his bottom desk drawer. Wrapping her filthy, ash-stained blanket around her shivering shoulders, Hazel began the treacherous descent. She navigated the narrow, vertical drop between the library and the study, using the exposed wooden studs as a ladder. Her muscles screamed in protest, weak and trembling. The wood beneath her fingers felt slick with the ambient dampness of the storm. When she finally reached the space directly above the study ceiling, she paused. The architecture here was different, an intricate, suspended plaster ceiling reinforced by thick oak beams. Hazel usually crawled across the central beam to reach the wall cavity behind the pantry, but tonight her coordination was shot. As she shimmied onto the beam, a low murmur of voices froze her blood. She pressed her eye to a crack in the plaster. The study wasn't empty. Below her, standing by the fireplace, were Garrick and Rosalind, but there were others too. 3 massive, scarred wolves from the rival Ironwood pack, men Hazel recognized from the massacre of her hometown. The perimeter guards have been rotated. Just as we agreed, Garrick was saying, pouring himself a glass of Silas's prized whiskey. Silas will be entirely focused on the solstice ceremony at midnight. His personal security detail will be at the bonfire. And the Alpha, one of the Ironwood wolves, rumbled, his voice like grinding stones. He is not easily killed. Even surrounded, his beast is a nightmare. Which is why you will use this. Rosalind stepped forward, placing a velvet box on the mahogany desk. She flipped it open. Inside lay a sleek, silver-tipped crossbow bolt, etched with glowing, toxic green runes. Wolfsbane, concentrated and mixed with crushed black hemlock. A single scratch will paralyze his wolf. A direct hit to the heart will turn him to ash. Hazel clamped her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. It was an assassination plot. Tonight, they were going to kill the Alpha who, despite his terrifying nature, was the only thing keeping the region from plunging into total, bloody warfare. She had to move. She didn't know what she could do, but staying above this treason was a death sentence. As she attempted to shift her weight backward, a sudden, violent coughing fit seized her lungs. She desperately bit down on her own arm to muffle the sound, but the spasm jerked her body. Her boot slipped off the oak beam. Time seemed to slow down. Her weight crashed down onto the fragile, decorative lath and plaster of the suspended ceiling. It was never meant to hold more than a few pounds. With a sickening, resounding crack that echoed over the thunder, the ceiling gave way. "What in the Garrick?" shouted below. Hazel plummeted into the void. She hit the floor amidst an avalanche of white plaster dust, splintered wood, and 2 years' worth of accumulated debris. She slammed onto the edge of Silas's heavy mahogany desk, sending Rosalind's velvet box flying across the room, before crumbling to the Persian rug in a heap of agonizing pain. For a second, the breath was completely knocked out of her. She lay in the ruins of the ceiling, a feral, filthy creature coated in white dust and grey ash, looking up at the shocked faces of the 5 conspirators. Garrick's eyes flashed a murderous, glowing yellow. His claws extended instantly. "A spy!" he roared, lunging forward to tear her throat out. Bang! The heavy oak doors of the study blew open with such force that the hinges screamed. The air in the room instantly dropped by 10 degrees, saturated with an aura of dominance so heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing down on Hazel's chest. Alpha Silas Blackwood stood in the doorway. He was drenched from the rain, his black suit clinging to his massive frame, but his amber eyes were burning with a terrifying, unholy fire. He didn't look at Garrick. He didn't look at Rosalind or the Ironwood wolves. His glowing gaze was locked entirely on the coughing, broken, dust-covered human girl bleeding on his rug. Garrick froze mid-lunge, immediately dropping his head in a show of forced submission. "Alpha, I caught this rat spying in the ceiling. I was just about to dispose of her." Silas walked slowly into the room. Every step he took resonated with lethal intent. He ignored his beta entirely. He stepped over the scattered debris, his expensive leather shoes crunching on the plaster. The 3 Ironwood wolves subtly backed toward the window, sensing the catastrophic shift in the room's dynamic. Silas stopped directly in front of Hazel. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating off his body, smelling the sharp, intoxicating scent of pine, petrichor, and pure, raw power. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs like a trapped bird. This was it, the infamous executioner. He was going to snap her neck himself. He slowly knelt down, the fabric of his trousers pulling taut over heavy muscle. He reached out a large, calloused hand. Hazel squeezed her eyes shut, preparing for the fatal blow. Instead, his long fingers gently brushed a piece of broken plaster from her matted hair. His knuckles grazed her cheek, and a jolt of static electricity snapped between their skin, causing both of them to gasp. Silas's pupils dilated until his eyes were almost entirely black. The wolf inside him surged forward, a profound, world-shattering realization slamming into him. The scent of ash and lavender had masked it from afar, but here, touching her, her true scent hit him like a physical blow. Wildflowers and honey. Mate. He looked at the hole in his ceiling, then down at her terrified, malnourished frame. The corners of his mouth twitched, breaking the deadly silence of the room. "How's the rent?" he asked, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. Before Hazel could even process the absurdity of the question, Silas stood up, gracefully turning his back to her to face his beta and the assassins. The softness in his demeanor vanished instantly, replaced by a monstrous, lethal calm. "Now," Silas said softly, the claws on his right hand slowly unsheathing with a metallic snikt. "Which one of you is going to explain why you were about to touch what is mine?" The silence that followed Silas's question was heavy enough to crush bone. Hazel lay frozen against the splintered wood and chunks of plaster, her breath hitching painfully in her chest. She had spent 24 months observing Silas Blackwood. She knew the subtle shifts in his posture, the way his shoulders squared before a strike, the way his amber eyes fractured into liquid gold when his wolf clawed near the surface. Right now, he was entirely still, which was the most terrifying state of all. Garrick, however, miscalculated entirely. Driven by the desperation of a cornered rat, the beta's face contorted. "She's a spy, Silas. An ironwood plant. They sent her to sabotage the solstice." It was a pathetic, transparent lie, but it was the only cover Garrick had. He lunged, not at Silas, but at Hazel, aiming to silence the only witness to their treason before the Alpha could extract the truth. He never made it. Silas moved with a speed that defied the laws of physics. 1 second, he was standing over Hazel. The next, a deafening crack echoed through the study. Silas had intercepted Garrick mid-air, a massive hand clamped around the beta's throat. The sheer momentum carried them both backward, slamming Garrick into the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves with enough force to shatter the thick mahogany panels and send antique leather-bound volumes raining down around them. "You brought ironwood filth into my territory," Silas snarled, his voice a demonic resonance that rattled the teacups on the sideboard. "You plotted against your alpha, and then, Garrick, you had the absolute audacity to lunge at my mate." The word hung in the air, paralyzing the room. "Mate." Rosalind gasped, taking a stumbling step backward, her perfectly manicured hands flying to her mouth. The three Ironwood assassins exchanged panicked, wide-eyed glances. Even Hazel, struggling to push herself up onto her bruised elbows, felt a shockwave of disbelief cut through her fever haze. Mate. The word was sacred in shifter lore, a bond of soul and blood. He couldn't mean her. She was a human, a filthy, starving stowaway who smelled like chimney ash. "Kill him!" Rosalind suddenly shrieked, her jealousy overriding her survival instincts. She scrambled toward the desk, her eyes fixed on the velvet box containing the wolfsbane-laced crossbow bolt. "If he lives, we all burn. Kill him now." The three Ironwood wolves didn't need to be told twice. They shifted mid-stride, bones popping and realigning with sickening crunches as they transformed into massive, hulking beasts of grey and brown fur. They descended on Silas in a coordinated, triangular strike. What followed was a display of apex violence that Hazel would see in her nightmares for years to come. Silas didn't fully shift. He didn't need to. Letting out a roar that shook the plaster dust from the remaining ceiling, he met the charge head-on. He caught the first wolf by the jaws, muscles bulging under his tailored suit jacket, and brutally slammed the beast's head against the edge of the heavy marble fireplace. The sickening crunch of bone ended the first threat instantly. The second wolf tore into Silas's shoulder, its jaws locking around his bicep. Silas didn't even flinch. He drove a brutal, localized strike into the wolf's ribs, breaking them inward, before violently throwing the massive animal through the study's reinforced glass window. The shattering glass mixed with the roaring thunder outside. Hazel watched, paralyzed, but her peripheral vision caught movement. Rosalind had reached the desk. She had snatched a small, tactical repeating crossbow from her coat, a sleek, modern weapon that looked entirely out of place in the Gothic room, and was hurriedly loading the glowing, green-runed bolt into the chamber. Silas was distracted, locked in a brutal grapple with the third and largest Ironwood wolf. His back was turned to Rosalind. "Silas!" Hazel tried to scream, but her throat, raw from 2 years of silent, suppressed coughing and her current infection, only produced a reedy, broken croak. Rosalind raised the crossbow, her eyes narrowed with lethal intent, aiming squarely for the center of Silas's broad back. Hazel didn't think. Instinct, forged by 2 years of desperate survival, took over. Her body was weak, trembling with fever and starvation, but she was small and close to the floor. She grabbed the heaviest object within, reach a solid brass Zippo lighter that Silas had left, resting on the edge of the desk, and threw it with every ounce of strength she had left. Her aim was terrible, but it didn't need to be perfect. The heavy brass struck Rosalind sharply on the wrist just as she pulled the trigger. The crossbow twanged violently. The wolfsbane bolt, glowing with toxic malice, shot wide. Instead of burying itself in Silas's spine, it hissed through the air and embedded itself deep into the fleshy thigh of the third Ironwood wolf, just as Silas pinned it to the ground. The beast let out an agonizing, high-pitched yelp that dissolved into a pathetic whine. The concentrated black hemlock and wolfsbane took effect immediately. Black veins spider-webbed from the wound, and the wolf collapsed, totally paralyzed and frothing at the mouth. Silas dropped the incapacitated wolf and whipped around. His chest heaved, his suit torn and soaked in blood, though very little of it was his own. He saw the crossbow in Rosalind's trembling hands. He saw the brass Zippo lighter spinning on the floor. And then he looked at Hazel, who had collapsed back into the plaster dust, her energy entirely spent, gasping for air. The murderous rage in Silas's eyes instantly extinguished. He crossed the room in 2 strides. Rosalind dropped the crossbow and fell to her knees, sobbing for mercy, but Silas walked right past her. He ignored Garrick, who was unconscious and bleeding profusely against the bookshelves. He knelt beside Hazel, who was currently curled into a tight, defensive ball, instinctively waiting for the punishment her mind insisted was coming. "Don't," Hazel whispered, a pathetic, raspy sound. She squeezed her eyes shut. "Please, I'll leave. I'll just leave." Silas didn't strike her. Instead, large, burning hot hands, remarkably gentle despite the blood staining his knuckles, slid under her knees and behind her back. He lifted her effortlessly into his arms. "You're not going anywhere," Silas murmured, his voice a deep, soothing rumble against her ear. He looked down at her ash-streaked face, his expression a complicated mix of awe, fury, and a terrifyingly possessive tenderness. "You've been living in my walls. The rent is long overdue." Hazel faded in and out of consciousness. The transition from the freezing, jagged darkness of the crawl spaces to the blinding light and overwhelming sensory input of the manor's interior was too much for her fevered brain. She vaguely registered the shouting in the hallways. She heard Silas snapping orders, his voice cracking like a whip. "Lock the east wing. Throw Garrick and Rosalind in the deep cells. If either of them bleeds out before I can interrogate them, I will hold the guards personally responsible. And get Dr. Sterling. Now." When Hazel finally opened her eyes with any semblance of clarity, she wasn't in a dungeon. She was lying on something impossibly soft. She blinked against the warm, dim light. Above her was an ornate, vaulted ceiling adorned with dark oak beams, but this one was intact. She was in a bed, an enormous, four-poster bed draped in heavy, dark green velvet, the mattress so thick and the down comforter so warm it felt like sinking into a cloud. For a girl who had slept on raw fiberglass insulation and loose floorboards for 24 months, it felt entirely alien. Panic seized her. She scrambled backward, tangling her legs in the fine Egyptian cotton sheets, pressing her back against the tufted headboard. Her lungs protested the sudden movement, plunging her into a violent, hacking, coughing fit. "Easy. Try not to move too quickly." Hazel flinched, pulling her knees to her chest. Sitting in a leather wingback chair near the roaring fireplace was an older man with silver hair and kind, tired eyes. He wore a rumpled cardigan and held a stethoscope. Standing directly behind him, looming like a thundercloud in a fresh, unbloodied black shirt, was Silas. Silas's gaze was fixed on her, heavy and unblinking. The intensity of his focus made Hazel want to crawl under the bed. "I'm Dr. Sterling," the older man said softly, keeping his voice carefully modulated. He recognized the feral, terrified look in her eyes. He had seen it in rescued fighting wolves. "You're safe here, sweetheart. But you are very, very sick. You have a severe bilateral respiratory infection, likely pneumonia, and you are critically malnourished. I need to give you some medicine." Hazel didn't respond. She just stared at them, her wide, hollow eyes darting from the doctor to the Alpha, calculating the distance to the heavy oak door. "Hazel," Silas spoke. Her breath hitched. He knew her name. How did he know her name? "The doctor is going to administer a shot of Rocephin. It's a strong antibiotic, and he needs to start an IV of lactated ringers to rehydrate you. Will you allow him to approach?" The fact that the most feared Alpha in the territory was asking for her permission caused a cognitive dissonance so sharp it gave her a headache. "How?" Hazel's voice was a rusted hinge. She swallowed hard, wincing at the pain in her throat. "How do you know my name?" Silas stepped forward, the floorboards groaning slightly under his weight. 2 years ago, during the lockdown, a human restoration archivist named Hazel Vance vanished. The local police assumed she fled the state during the riots. I found your abandoned satchel in the library 3 days later. He paused, his jaw ticking. "I assumed you had run. The idea that you were trapped, that you hid." He stopped, seemingly struggling to contain the volatile mix of emotions churning inside him. His wolf was screaming to tear the house down to the foundations for allowing its mate to suffer, right under its nose. "Doctor." Sterling slowly approached the bed, holding up a syringe and a bag of clear IV fluids. "May I?" Hazel hesitated. She looked at the needles, then at Silas. If he wanted her dead, he would have let Garrick tear her apart, or he would have snapped her neck himself. Survival in the walls had required cold, hard logic. Logic dictated that drinking the medicine was better than dying of pneumonia. She gave a stiff, jerky nod. The prick of the needle was nothing compared to the phantom pains of the cold walls. As doctor, Sterling taped the IV line to the back of her bruised, filthy hand. Silas stepped closer, sitting on the edge of the mattress. The mattress dipped significantly under his weight. 2 years, Silas said quietly, his amber eyes scanning her hollow cheeks, the dark circles under her eyes, and the unnatural grey pallor of her skin beneath the layers of ash and dirt. "How did you survive in the crawl spaces for 2 years?" "Kitchen," Hazel mumbled. feeling the cold rush of the IV fluids entering her bloodstream. It felt bizarrely good. 3A. M. Stole scraps. Drank from the boiler condensation pipes. Dr. Sterling stopped adjusting the IV pole and stared at her, horrified. You drank boiler water? Good God, girl. It's a miracle you don't have heavy metal poisoning. Had to, Hazel rasped, shrinking away from Silas's proximity. The scent of him, pine and earth and raw power, was overwhelming now that she wasn't filtering it through layers of dried lavender. Had to hide. Alpha. Silas. He kills humans. Silas flinched. The movement was so small, so microscopic, that anyone else would have missed it. But Hazel had spent 2 years studying him. She saw the flash of genuine pain in his eyes. I protect my pack, Silas corrected, his voice tight. I execute threats. I have never hunted an innocent. He leaned closer, his gaze dropping to her lips before meeting her eyes again. And I certainly do not harm what is mine. I'm not yours, Hazel said, the stubborn, survivalist part of her flaring to life despite her exhaustion. I'm just a squatter. I fell through the ceiling. A slow, devastatingly handsome smirk touched the corner of Silas's mouth, entirely transforming his severe face. It was the first time she had ever seen him smile. Ah, yes, the ceiling. He reached out, his long fingers gently capturing a stray, ash-coated lock of her hair, rubbing it between his thumb and forefinger. About that, structural damage to a heritage property, unauthorized occupancy, theft of provisions. The bill is racking up, Hazel. Hazel stared at him, bewildered. Was he joking? The terrifying warlord of the Pacific Northwest was making a real estate joke while she was hooked up to an IV. I don't have any money, she whispered defensively. Silas's eyes darkened, the amber bleeding back into that hypnotic, predatory gold. He leaned in until his lips were mere inches from her ear, sending a shiver down her spine that had absolutely nothing to do with her fever. That's perfectly fine, little ghost, he murmured, his breath warm against her skin. We have the rest of our lives to negotiate the terms of your repayment. The sub-levels of Blackwood Keep were a stark, brutal contrast to the opulent velvet and mahogany of the upper floors. Built deep into the granite foundation of the Cascade Mountains, the holding cells were a relic of a darker, bloodier era in shifter history. The air down here smelled permanently of damp earth, rust, and the metallic tang of old fear. Silas Blackwood descended the spiraling stone staircase, his heavy boots echoing off the walls like the tolling of a funeral bell. He had left Hazel asleep in his bed, heavily medicated and guarded by his 2 most trusted enforcers, brothers named Wyatt and Cole. Leaving her had felt like tearing a vital organ from his chest. His inner wolf was a frantic, pacing mass of possessive instinct, demanding he return to the master suite and wrap himself around his frail, ash-scented human mate until the world burned down around them. But Silas was an alpha, and before he could be a mate, he had an empire to sanitize. He reached the heavy iron door of the primary cell block. It swung open on well-oiled hinges, revealing a cavernous, dimly lit room. Suspended from the ceiling by thick chains, forged with traces of pure silver, a metal that burned shifter skin on contact, and suppressed their healing abilities, was his former beta, Garrick. In the adjacent cell, separated by reinforced glass, sat Rosalind. She wasn't chained, but she was pacing frantically, her silk solstice gown torn and stained with plaster dust. Silas stepped into the light. The temperature in the room plummeted. Garrick let out a ragged, wet cough, blood dripping from his chin onto his bare chest. The silver cuffs around his wrists were already causing the skin to blister and blacken. Silas, Garrick wheezed, attempting a defiant smirk that faltered under the Alpha's crushing aura. Come to gloat? Or did your little human pet die of fright? In a fraction of a second, Silas crossed the room. He didn't yell. He didn't shift. He merely placed one hand firmly against the center of Garrick's chest and pressed. The sickening crack of 3 ribs, snapping in unison, echoed off the stone. Garrick screamed, a high, desperate sound that made Rosalind cover her ears in the next cell. You will not speak of her, Silas said, his voice a low, terrifying vibration that shook the dust from the ceiling. You will not think of her. If her name crosses your mind, I will carve it out of your skull myself. Do we understand each other, Garrick? Garrick nodded frantically, his eyes rolling back in excruciating pain. Silas withdrew his hand, calmly pulling a pristine white handkerchief from his pocket to wipe a single drop of the beater's blood off his knuckles. The Ironwood Pack lacks the resources to orchestrate an assassination of this magnitude. They are scavengers. That wolfsbane bolt, the black hemlock derivative that is expensive, untraceable poison. It requires financing. It requires political cover. Silas stepped closer, his golden eyes locking onto Garrick's terrified pupils. "Who bought you, Garrick? Because I know it wasn't cheap." Silence stretched. Garrick swallowed hard, looking toward Rosalind for support, but she was huddled in the corner of her cell, weeping silently. "If I tell you," Garrick rasped, "he'll kill my family. He'll wipe my bloodline from the registry." "If you don't tell me," Silas replied evenly, folding the handkerchief and placing it back in his pocket, "I will ensure your bloodline watches as I feed you to the Deep Woods rogues piece by piece. You violated the Cascade Mountains shifter accord. You brought weapons into a sanctuary territory. You are entirely devoid of rights." The absolute certainty in Silas's voice broke whatever loyalty the traitor had left. Garrick slumped against the silver chains, sobbing openly now. "Arthur Penhaligon," Garrick whispered, the name dropping like a lead weight in the damp air. "Councillor Penhaligon. He wants the Seattle shipping ports. He said you were a roadblock to the council's modernization, that your isolationism was hurting the economy. He funded the Ironwoods to take you out during the solstice, so the council could step in under the guise of restoring order." Silas closed his eyes, a cold, calculating fury settling over his features. Arthur Penhaligon, the senior member of the North American High Council, the man who had sat at Silas's own dining table 3 months ago, drinking his wine and shaking his hand. "He's coming," Rosalind suddenly spoke up from the adjacent cell, her voice trembling. She pressed her tear-streaked face against the glass. "He's coming here, Silas. Penhaligon's convoy was scheduled to arrive tomorrow morning for the gala. He expects to find you dead, and Garrick acting as the grieving interim alpha." Silas turned to look at the weeping woman. The sheer audacity of the betrayal was staggering. "Wyatt," Silas called out over his shoulder. The heavy iron door opened, and Wyatt stepped inside, bowing his head respectfully. "Yes, Alpha?" "Strip Garrick of his pack markings. Burn them off. Leave him here to rot until the council arrives," Silas ordered, his tone devoid of any emotion. "And Rosalind, confine her to the tower. When Penhaligon arrives tomorrow, he will find out exactly what happens when you try to cage a monster." When Hazel woke up the second time, the crushing weight on her chest had lessened. The sharp, stabbing pain of her pneumonia was receding into a dull ache, subdued by the heavy antibiotics pumping through her veins. She opened her eyes, immediately mapping her surroundings. It was an ingrained survival tactic. 4-poster bed, 2 massive windows overlooking a dense, snow-covered pine forest, a heavy oak door to the left, a bathroom door slightly ajar to the right. No ventilation grates large enough to squeeze through. She was effectively trapped. Her stomach let out a violent, echoing rumble. As if on cue, the bedroom door clicked open. Hazel scrambled backward against the headboard, instinctively pulling the heavy duvet up to her chin, her eyes wide and feral. It wasn't Silas. It was a plump, silver-haired woman in a pristine white apron, carrying a massive silver tray. Hazel recognized her instantly. It was Mrs. Gable, the estate's formidable housekeeper. Hazel had spent countless hours watching this woman meticulously polish the library's silver from her peephole behind the tapestry. "Oh, you poor, fragile little bird," Mrs. Gable cooed, her stern face melting into an expression of profound, motherly sorrow. She set the tray down on a small mahogany table near the bed. "Alpha Silas said you were awake, but heavens above, you are nothing but skin and bones." The smell hitting Hazel's nose was intoxicating. Freshly baked sourdough bread, rich beef stew, roasted root vegetables, and a tall glass of cold, fresh milk. Hazel hadn't seen a meal like this in 2 years. Her mouth watered so violently it physically ached. "Please, eat," Mrs. Gable said gently, stepping back to give her space. "Dr. Sterling said you need to take it slow, but you need calories." Hazel didn't wait to be told twice. Driven by 2 years of profound starvation, she lunged forward. She grabbed a warm, buttered roll with trembling hands and shoved it into her mouth, nearly choking as she swallowed it whole. She grabbed the spoon and began shoveling the rich stew into her mouth, tears of absolute euphoria springing to her eyes at the taste of real meat and salt. Within 5 minutes, the tray was decimated, but the trauma of the walls was a hard master. As Mrs. Gable turned her back to draw the heavy velvet curtains, Hazel's survival instinct flared. She grabbed the last remaining bread roll, quickly wrapping it in a linen napkin, and shoved it deep under her pillow, hiding it, just in case. "Better?" The deep, rumbling voice came from the doorway. Hazel froze, her hand still hovering near the pillow. Silas leaned against the doorframe. He had changed into dark denim and a soft charcoal sweater, looking decidedly less like an executioner and more like a rugged, devastatingly handsome woodsman. But the aura of raw power surrounding him was suffocating. Mrs. Gable immediately bowed her head. "I will fetch a fresh pitcher of water, Alpha," she murmured, quickly exiting the room and closing the heavy door behind her with a soft click. They were alone. Silas walked slowly toward the bed. Hazel's heart hammered against her ribs. She pressed her back into the headboard again, pulling her knees up defensively. Silas stopped at the edge of the mattress. His amber eyes flicked down to the pillow, then back up to her face. He reached out, his movements incredibly slow and telegraphed, and slipped his hand under the pillow. He pulled out the linen-wrapped bread roll. Hazel flinched, expecting him to yell, to punish her for stealing. The alpha wolves she remembered from her childhood stories hoarded their resources violently. Instead, Silas's expression crumpled. He looked at the stolen bread, a profound, agonizing sadness washing over his sharp features. He slowly set the roll on the nightstand. "You will never have to hide food again," Silas said softly, his voice thick with an emotion Hazel couldn't identify. "There is a kitchen downstairs that runs 24 hours a day. You can have anything you want, whenever you want it. You don't have to steal from me, Hazel." Hazel swallowed hard. "Old habits," she rasped, her voice still hoarse. Silas sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. He pulled up the leather wingback chair and sat down, putting himself at eye level with her. "We need to talk. About what happened downstairs, about what you are to me." "I know what I am," Hazel interrupted, her human logic trying to outpace her fear. "I'm a human. You're a shifter. We don't mix. The Accord of 2018 forbids non-sanctioned cohabitation. You let me go. I sign an NDA. I disappear. Nobody has to know." Silas let out a dark, breathless chuckle. "Disappear? Hazel, if you walk out that door, my wolf will tear down the entire Pacific Northwest to find you and drag you back. It's not a choice. It's a biological imperative. You are my mate." "That's biologically impossible," Hazel shot back, clutching the duvet tighter. "I don't have a wolf." "You don't need one," Silas explained, leaning forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "The mate bond is an ancient, pheromonal lock. It's incredibly rare for a wolf to mate with a human, but it happens. My soul recognized yours the second my skin touched yours. Why do you think you survived in my walls for 2 years? Any other human, any other scent, and my enforcers would have sniffed you out in a day. Your scent, even masked by ash, it registered to my subconscious as home. I ignored it because my wolf wanted it there." Hazel stared at him, her mind spinning. 2 years of terror, of hiding in the freezing dark, and she was the safest person in the entire manor? It was a cruel, twisted joke. "I heard them," Hazel whispered suddenly, changing the subject. The vulnerability was too much. She needed to prove her usefulness. "Garrick and Rosalind. I heard them plotting for months." Silas's eyes narrowed slightly, the alpha predator instantly re-emerging. "How?" "The ventilation ducts," Hazel said, gesturing weakly toward the ceiling. "The manor's blueprints are flawed. The 1890s renovation connected the primary air returns from the grand study to the acoustic chamber above the ballroom. If you sit on the central crossbeam above the library, you can hear every whisper in your study perfectly amplified. It's an architectural eavesdropping tube." Silas stared at her in stunned silence. He had lived in this fortress his entire life. He employed a dozen security specialists, and a 22-year-old human girl had figured out a fatal flaw in his perimeter just to survive. "You're a brilliant, terrifying little creature," Silas murmured, a genuine smile playing on his lips. "You know my house better than I do." "I know everything," Hazel said defensively, raising her chin. "I know Beta Garrick skimmed from the packed treasury to buy his suits. I know Mrs. Gable secretly feeds the stray cats by the garden gate. And I know you. She hesitated, her courage faltering. You know what about me, Hazel? Silas pressed gently, his amber eyes burning with intense curiosity. I know you don't sleep, she whispered softly. I listen to you pace in your study until dawn. Every night. For 2 years. You're as trapped in this house as I was. The air in the room stood absolutely still. Silas looked at her, entirely stripped of his terrifying armor. For the first time, he wasn't looking at a stowaway or a fragile human. He was looking at an equal, someone who saw the monster and wasn't blinded by the fear. Before Silas could respond, a frantic, thunderous knocking echoed from the heavy oak door. Alpha! Wyatt's voice barked from the hallway, laced with genuine panic. Silas stood up instantly, his demeanor snapping back to the ruthless warlord. Enter. Wyatt pushed the door open, his chest heaving. Alpha. The perimeter alarms just triggered at the southern gate. It's a massive motorcade. Armored SUVs. Silas's jaw clenched. Penhaligon. Yes, sir. Wyatt swallowed hard. Councillor Penhaligon is here, and he's demanding to see the body of the Alpha he was told was assassinated last night. Silas turned slowly to look at Hazel. The softness was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating violence. He reached down and gently brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. Rest, my little ghost, Silas commanded softly. I have to go collect the rent from the High Council. The courtyard of Blackwood Keep, usually blanketed in the pristine, undisturbed silence of the remote Washington mountains, was currently a scene of militant chaos. A fleet of 6 heavily armored, matte black Cadillac Escalades idled menacingly on the cobblestones. The exhaust plumed into the freezing morning air like the breath of mechanical beasts. This was not a diplomatic visit. It was a hostile takeover masked as a condolence call. Silas Blackwood stood on the top step of the grand entrance, flanked only by Wyatt and Cole. He wore no coat against the biting wind, his imposing frame clad in a tailored black suit that hid the bandaged remnants of last night's brutal skirmish. His expression was a mask of cold, impenetrable granite. The door of the lead SUV opened. Stepping out into the snow was Arthur Penhaligon. He was a distinguished man in his late 60s, wearing a custom vicuña overcoat and a silk scarf. To the human world, Penhaligon was known as a prominent Seattle real estate magnate and a silent partner in the massive Vanguard shipping conglomerate. To the supernatural world, he was the venomous, string-pulling head of the High Council. Behind Penhaligon stepped 4 massive enforcers, their eyes scanning the perimeter with the cold precision of trained killers. Penhaligon looked up at the steps, the practiced look of somber mourning on his face instantly shattered. He stopped dead in his tracks, his expensive leather shoes sinking into the snow. The color drained from his weathered face, leaving him looking like a freshly exhumed corpse. Silas, Penhaligon choked out, the single word carrying the weight of a dying man's final breath. Arthur, Silas replied, his voice rolling across the courtyard like distant thunder. He didn't move an inch. You're early for the Solstice Gala, and you brought a rather large security detail for a celebration. Penhaligon was a master politician, but the sheer shock of seeing the man he had paid millions to have assassinated, standing before him, very much alive and radiating an aura of lethal dominance, fractured his composure. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically toward the heavy oak doors, desperately searching for Garrick. We received a distress signal, Penhaligon stammered, his mind racing to reconstruct his shattered narrative. A rogue transmission at dawn. It stated that the keep had been breached by Ironwood insurgents, that you had fallen, Silas. I came to secure the territory and prevent a vacuum of power. A distress signal, Silas repeated softly, the words dripping with razor-sharp sarcasm. He slowly descended the first 3 stone steps, the movement causing Penhaligon's guards to instinctively reach for the heavy, silver-loaded sidearms holstered inside their coats. Fascinating, especially since I personally severed the estate's external communication lines last night at midnight. Penhaligon's jaw tightened. The trap was closing. Then it must have been a delayed transmission. Thank the ancestors you survived, Silas. Where is Beta Garrick? He should be here, managing the perimeter. Garrick, Silas mused, finally reaching the cobblestones. He stood mere feet from the councillor, towering over the older man. Garrick is currently indisposed. He had an unfortunate accident involving 30 feet of silver chain and his own treasonous tongue. But he was very talkative before he lost his voice. Arthur, He told me all about your little corporate merger, about Vanguard Shipping needing my ports in Tacoma, about the Black Hemlock. Penhaligon's facade completely disintegrated. The diplomatic pretense was over. He took a calculated step back behind his lead enforcer. You're delirious from your injuries, Blackwood. You're accusing a High Counselor of treason based on the tortured ramblings of a traitorous beta. The Council will strip you of your alpha status for this insolence. The Council isn't here, Arthur, Silas whispered, his amber eyes flashing with a predatory, blinding gold. Only I am. Kill him, Penhaligon shrieked, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated terror. Kill him now. The 4 Council guards drew their weapons, moving with terrifying speed. But they had fundamentally underestimated the monster they were dealing with. Hazel, watching through the frost-covered glass of the master suite, felt her heart hammer violently against her bruised ribs. The heavy dose of antibiotics coursing through her veins had granted her a temporary, desperate surge of energy, but she was still agonizingly weak. Down in the courtyard, the standoff was escalating into a bloodbath. Elite Council enforcers, armed with specialized silver artillery, were drawing their weapons on Silas. She knew Silas was an apex predator, a force of nature, but a coordinated strike with silver bullets could shred even an alpha of his terrifying magnitude. Hazel knew she couldn't just stand there. She couldn't watch the only man who had shown her genuine mercy get gunned down in the snow. Turning away from the window, Hazel allowed 2 years of survival instincts to take over. She didn't think like a fragile human anymore. She thought like the architect of the keep's shadows. She knew the manor's forgotten arteries better than the alpha who owned it. Staggering out of the master suite, her bare feet silent on the thick hallway rugs, she slipped into the adjacent drawing room. Her eyes locked onto the massive, carved marble fireplace. This was the central chimney stack, the structural spine of the keep. Gritting her teeth against the searing, white-hot pain in her lungs, Hazel wedged herself into the narrow maintenance gap beside the flue. It was pitch black, freezing, and smelled of decades of soot. She began to climb, her raw fingers finding the familiar, rusted iron rungs set deep into the stone. She needed to reach the old armory control room on the 2nd floor, a forgotten relic from the 1920s that controlled the heavy iron portcullis and the automated lockdown shutters. Down in the courtyard, absolute hell had broken loose. Silas hadn't even bothered to shift into his wolf form. He moved like a localized, devastating hurricane. The first silver bullet grazed his broad shoulder, hissing violently as it burned his skin, but he didn't even slow down. He shattered a guard's wrist with a single, brutal strike, using the man's own momentum to hurl him into the side of the escalade, leaving a massive dent in the armored door. Wyatt and Cole engaged the other 2 guards, the freezing mountain air filling with the deafening roar of gunfire and the guttural snarls of shifting wolves. Councillor Penhaligon was scrambling backward in the snow, desperately trying to yank open the door of his vehicle. He was abandoning his men to save his own skin. "You can't run from this, Arthur," Silas roared, his voice distorting into a demonic growl as he vaulted over the hood of the SUV, landing squarely in front of the terrified councillor. Just as Silas reached out to wrap his massive hand around Penhaligon's throat, a deafening, metallic screech echoed across the valley. Every window on the ground floor of Blackwood Keep suddenly slammed shut with heavy, iron-reinforced blast shutters. A second later, the spiked iron portcullis at the main gate dropped with a ground-shaking boom, trapping the 6 escalades and Penhaligon inside the courtyard walls. Silas froze, looking back at the keep in absolute astonishment. Only one person knew the manual override codes for that antique security system. He looked up at the 2nd-floor armory window. Through the soot-coated glass, gasping for air, stood Hazel. She had a bloody hand pressed against the pane, her wide eyes locked onto his. She had sealed the councillor in. A profound, overwhelming wave of possessive pride surged through Silas's chest, his brilliant, unbreakable human mate. Penhaligon collapsed to his knees in the snow, weeping in pathetic surrender. Silas ordered Wyatt to throw the councillor in the deep cells next to Garrick, turning his back on the political fallout. He strode through the heavy oak doors, taking the grand mahogany staircase 3 steps at a time. He found Hazel collapsed on the floor of the 2nd-story hallway, her adrenaline spent, shivering violently. Her hands were raw and bleeding from the iron rungs. Silas dropped to his knees, scooping her up into his arms and pressing her face against his chest. "You locked down a fortress," Silas murmured, his amber eyes glowing with soft, reverent light as he carried her back to the master suite. "You trapped the head of the High Council." Hazel managed a weak, exhausted smile. "I know the walls," she whispered. Silas chuckled, a deep, rich sound. "Yes, you do, but you won't be living in them ever again. The keep is yours, Hazel. It belongs to the Luna." And that brings us to the thrilling end of Hazel and Silas's story. From a starving ghost hiding in the freezing crawl spaces to the brilliant Luna who locked down a fortress and saved the Alpha's life, Hazel proved that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one nobody knows is there. Silas finally found the mate his soul was searching for, and Councillor Penhaligon is going to have a very long, very miserable stay in the deep cells. What was your favorite twist in this story? Did you expect Hazel to be the one to trap the villains? Let us know in the comments below. If you love this werewolf romance drama and want to hear more intense, suspenseful stories, please like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss our next upload. See you in the next story.
Hi, my name is Mountain Confessions, the owner and manager of Mountain Confessions. After watching the video, she lived in the walls of his castle for 2 years before he caught her. "How's the rent?" he asked. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was the strange mix of tension, loneliness, and humor underneath the story. Imagine surviving in secret for that long, always hiding, always listening, never truly feeling safe. Then, when she's finally discovered, the reaction isn't what anyone expected. That unexpected moment made the story feel both emotional and strangely comforting at the same time. Do you think the Alpha King knew something was happening in the castle long before he caught her, or was he genuinely surprised? And if you were in her situation, do you think you could survive completely unnoticed for that long? I think stories like this remind us that people often carry hidden struggles silently. And sometimes, kindness in unexpected moments can completely change someone's life. If this story made you smile or pulled you into the mystery, I'd really love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy emotional Alpha King stories filled with tension, survival, and unexpected connection, feel free to like and subscribe only if you'd like to see more.